The news and opinions expressed on Occupy Radio may not necessarily reflect the views of KWVA Eugene, the University of Oregon, or the Associated Students of the University of Oregon.
From KWVA in Eugene and the Occupy Eugene Media Group, this is Occupy Radio, an extended conversation about the issues which gave rise to the Occupy movement. I'm your host, David Geitgey Sierralupe.
We have to get people to believe that that is their money that was stolen. And unless we can frame it in a way that they really realize that is stolen dollars, that CEO that is getting $100 million, that's stolen money from the workers, unless we get people to start thinking in that frame, the corporatocracy frame of thinking that prevails on TV is what we get.
Class warfare has been a slanted story from the start, occupiers. This week on Occupy Radio, we bring on radio host and blogger Egberto Willies to talk about how the rich can trumpet their persecution through the corporate media, while the attacks on the growing ranks of the poor are being left to be covered by citizen journalists like us.
Howdy, occupiers, and welcome to Occupy Radio. I'm David Geitgey Sierralupe, and you can all call me Getch. I'm here on this warm, if not hot, summer day with my pal, Rivera's son. How you doing today, Rivera?
Oh, just lovely. We all made it through the 4th of July unscathed and with a little bit more awareness of what's going on in our country's history.
And some local love, might we add.
That is for sure. We had a lot of fun on the 4th of July. Our Arroyo Seco, which is right next door to where I live, right outside of Taos, hosts an annual 4th of July parade, which is a little bit quirky and a little bit more ordinary in terms of northern New Mexico, which is pretty extraordinary in terms of American culture in general. But we decided in our Love and Action group that we would do an activist whistleblowers and muckrakers procession to honor unsung heroes on this day. And we were graced by getting to carry 5 8 to 10 foot tall giant puppets of, we had Dolores Huerta, who started the United Farm Workers Union with Cesar Chavez. And we had Rosa Parks and Sadako and Amy Goodman, and I'm forgetting one.
I don't quite remember who you had out there, but they were very impressive. And I don't remember, you said that Code Pink helped you out with those puppets?
Yeah, they were built by 2 Code Pink ladies here just less than a mile from my house, actually, Jean Green and Marilyn Hoff, who built these things all by themselves, and they've actually toured the nation with Backbone campaign. So I felt very honored to get to carry them and to bring them out and bring them through Arroyo Seco with the parade. And, the honor was actually very surprising. The judges of the parade gave us an award for being the most patriotic display, which kind of blew our minds since I don't think any of us were carrying an American flag.
Yeah. Well, I hope that means that we're starting to see things differently as a nation and as communities, and that we're starting to see the things that you were celebrating in this march having value. The idea that whistleblowers should be valued because what they're doing, and usually acknowledging in advance that their actions are going to cause them trouble in their lives. No whistleblower ever steps forward thinking, this is going to turn out really well for me.
Right, and a lot of our whistleblowers, like John Kiriakou and Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, they give up a lot and they are quite persecuted by our society. So to come out in support of them, and not just whistleblowers, but also activists and muckraking journalists, people who are not appreciated by the mainstream of our culture, to come out with the historical examples. We had 70 names on banners and flags in this procession, and to connect the lineage of the past with the contemporary activists of the present was a very powerful thing for people to see, not just in Arroyo Seco and Taos, but all around the country when the photos went out. I mean, I've heard from so many people who are activists who have offered up words of how much it meant to them to see that we stood up for them and for this community of activists that we are all a part of, and how moved they were. Not just that we were out there, but that, our community decided that was the most patriotic float in the parade. It's been really an amazing thing and well worthwhile.
And you do have a lot of really nice photos, which we should make an effort to get onto occupyradio.org. I know that they're on Facebook right now, but that's something we should share with the listeners.
Oh, we can definitely do that there. It's pretty amazing. But speaking of activities and events coming up, aren't you heading somewhere this week?
Oh my, yes. Now, for the local Eugene listeners, this is no big shock, but I am going to spend the next week out at the Oregon Country Fair, which is our own attempt here in Eugene to open up the 60s time capsule and let it parade around through a local patch of land out in the woods in Veneta, Oregon. So that has made my life a little hectic and crazy because I have, a remodeling job, and y'all might have noticed a weekly radio show, and all those things have to get put on hold for a week while I'm out at the fair. But unfortunately, all those things want to keep on going at the same time. So yeah, we're still going to have Occupy Radio next week. I'm just going to have to do it a little bit quicker is all.
Well, we can give you Activist Radio Host Award of the Year for your commitment to getting out the show with everything else going on.
All right. Next year, I get to be honored in the Arroyo Seco Parade.
Yeah, I almost got you up on a banner there, but I have to admit I forgot. So next year, Getch, look for your name on our banners. And also people can send us suggestions. But, we should go and talk with our guest this week, Egberto Willies, who is a radio show host himself. And we're going to be talking with him about some class warfare.
Egberto Willies is a political activist, author, political blogger, radio show host, business owner, software developer, web designer, and mechanical engineer in Kingwood, Texas. An ardent liberal who believes tolerance is essential. Egberto's favorite phrase is political involvement should be a requirement for citizenship. Egberto's radio show, Politics Done Right, airs weekly on Houston's KPFT 90.1 FM. In his book, As I See It, Class Warfare, the Only Resort to Right-Wing Doom, Egberto offers an analysis of the growing American oligarchy.
Egberto, thank you so much for joining us on Occupy Radio. It's going to be really fun to have you on the show today, I can tell.
Well, look, thank you very much for having me. I'm actually really happy to be here.
All right, and we are likewise happy. And we met you through Dan Marks, who's putting together Occupy Television, and started to check out your website and your book, As I See It, Class Warfare is the Only Resort to Right-Wing Doom. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I checked out your supporting material, and I would love to start our conversation, Egberto, by getting into your book, why you wrote it, and where you want to go with it.
Well, let me tell you, I don't know if you remember during the healthcare debate, things were really crazy in the country, and the right wing, and specifically the Tea Party, kind of used healthcare as a launching pad to destroy the Obama administration. And let me be clear right up front. I am not one of those that are sympathetic to, let's say, the Democratic Party for the sake of being sympathetic to the Democratic Party, or for that matter, hateful to the Republican Party for the sake of that. I simply believe in having good policy that protects us all. So I remember when all of this was occurring and the crazy things that was happening in the country, I actually felt helpless. I've always been an activist from college days, where we stood up with banners and boots and berets to march against the apartheid in South Africa when we got the University of Texas to divest from there. All of that was in me, but still going forward after you get your jobs and you do all of that, you kind of feel helpless of the politics around you. And I remember sitting down in a Starbucks and saying, you know what, I'm just going to write a book and sort of lay things out in the perspective that I kind of wanted to do. And, after sitting down there for quite a while, I said, I can actually do this. It's amazing that in today's world, one laptop and the internet at your disposal, how much information you can actually get. I mean, information that you don't really know that you need until you decide to sit down there and write a book.
Or do a radio show.
Right, exactly. So, I started writing, and believe it or not, I learned so much more about the topics in the process of writing the book, even more so than I actually thought I knew. And it even gave me more impetus then to actually write the book, because if I thought I knew all this stuff, and it turns out that in writing this, I'm learning so much more stuff, I think this is something that could make a difference in my little minute part of the world. I know it's very small. I'm not trying to think that it's going to do, that much, but I think if there are thousands of us doing this, which I think thousands of us could be doing this, we can actually make a difference, because you know how permutations work, Few of us do it, others take up and do it. Look at what you're doing here, I mean, so that's where it started. And I wrote the thing. And after I wrote the thing, I had to determine if I was going to try to get somebody to publish it or self-publish. I said, you know what? Look, we have a network here. You have a network. All of us have networks. This is a social media age. I'm going to do it through the process that Amazon had. And I went through that process, and voila, as I see it.
It's great. I also do a similar process with my novels, and we really are, as you said, living in a different age when we are seeing an intense democratization of the publishing industry, and I think that's very healthy and very timely. Let me ask you a little bit about class warfare. And I mean, we've actually heard that term bandied about in many different ways at this point in time. What does it mean to you?
Well, when I talk about class warfare, what I try to get across is not the effect that we want that real class. Whenever you say class warfare, people have a tendency to believe you want the lower classes to get out of their domains and get onto the street with pitchforks and go out there and fight the powers. That's not at all what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is looking at how things are working in this world right now, how things are happening with regards to the corporatocracy, how the corporations have a tax system that is stacked against the average person. When you have the average person paying 39 point, or not the average person, but when you have the regular American, the American citizen paying not 39.6% or somewhere in that vicinity for taxes, and the wealthy, because most of their taxes comes from a capital appreciation, only maxes out at, I think, with the changes in the last law, just north of 20% or so. That means that you have a system that is stacked against the average human being, the average American citizen, because most American citizens get wages. They don't get capital gains. When you have a social security system in which only the top $110,000 is taxed, and anything over that, millions, billions that you make after that goes untaxed, it means that the current system is rigged by class, and not only rigged by class, it has a material effect of how far you can move ahead in life, how far or how wealthy you can get based on where you start.
And the system right now where we live is clearly not designed to function for everybody involved. I mean, you just have to look at Walmart employees who barely can scrape by working full time with just horrible scheduling where they're totally at the mercy of the company and poor. And the only way they can make ends meet is through government subsidies. So, the system itself doesn't reward the efforts of the people who are supporting the system.
That is so true. And I'm glad that you brought up the Walmart issue, right? Because in effect, you just said that perfect fact, right? People in Walmart who make minimum wage or a little bit above minimum wage with a family, they don't make enough money to sustain themselves. And because America intrinsically is a good country, we are not going to have anybody starve. So we have a social safety net that is there to help. That safety net, the food stamps and rent allotments in different places, etc., that allows these people to survive. What that means, though, because that income is coming from the average American in the form of taxes, is that we are subsidizing the Walmarts and all these companies that pay little in wages, because those that work for them are supported partially as well by us. So in effect, it's sort of a reverse welfare, a welfare to corporations by them being able to pay a non-living wage.
Right. And when we talk about living wages, that's a very important thing to clarify, that the federal minimum wage is nothing close to what it actually costs to live in the United States. And I think that's a distinction that always needs to be said. When you look at class warfare in relationship to these issues, you've said it's not about pitchforks getting out there, angry poor people rising up violently. What is it about to you? What does a real addressing of the issues of class and income inequality, and particularly wealth and politics inequality system, what does it look like to address that?
I think the movement that you guys are a major part of, that we are all into. I know you did a whole lot of Occupy around the country, as I did here in Kingwood and Houston and other areas. We actually, to put it bluntly, we changed the discourse when the discourse needed to be changed, even though we didn't go through with it. Now, what does this class inequality mean, or how do we address it, or how do I think we address it? Well, if one person knew that right, that person would get it done. I believe that we have to make the conscious effort to talk to individuals, to talk to our neighbors, our acquaintances, our friends. And that may sound simple to handle a class inequality problem, but there are a class and an income inequality problem. But what is interesting is, if I go into a Starbucks and I sit down with a cup of coffee, and this guy next to me starts telling me how difficult things are and how, he's having a hard time and he wished the president would do better to get things working right. When you listen to a conversation like that, you're listening to somebody thinking that it is a politician that is going to solve our inequality problem specifically. And that gives us the segue or the opportunity immediately to look at that person and say, well, you're right. We're having income inequality problems. You're working harder for less. What are you going to do about it? And what do you think you can do about it? And at that point, start explaining how our process really works and that we can actually make a difference. I really would love to put that in the context of the election of David Bart in Virginia, because in as much as I share nothing within his ideology, I share nothing with his support for the Koch mantra and all of that. The one thing I think that race showed, a couple of authors at Daily Kos kind of came back and said, well, he really had support underhandedly from Koch. I don't really buy that completely. I think one thing these folks have been able to do, because I've also seen it here in Kingwood, is mobilize people on topics that they deem important for themselves. So I think if we allow ourselves to make these topics important to others, that others will react as all humans do and start taking the problem up themselves and bringing people in that will actually start solving our problem.
And it seems to me that the first issue we have to do is recognize that class warfare exists.
Amen.
Yeah. I mean, whenever those of us at the bottom level of the class structure raise the issue of class warfare, that's automatically shot down in the mainstream media as, I don't know, unfair, unseemly. How can you're resorting to class warfare? And you know what? We're just recognizing class warfare because the class warfare already exists and has for, the entire duration of our country. So that seems to me the first thing is that guy over there sitting across from me in Starbucks, we need to be able to say, we are in a country where class warfare exists, and you and I are in the same class. We have to gather our forces so that we can address the people who are taking advantage of us from their position on high.
That is so true. That is so true. Whenever people talk about class warfare, there's a report that came out, I think sometime this week, and it was talking about healthcare. I talk a lot about healthcare because my wife has lupus, and, we've always had healthcare, but it continues to go up in price to where at one point, when it started to become unaffordable, this thing called Obamacare, even though it's not single payer, what we fought for made life better in my own household. But the report came out this week, I think it was, that said, first of all, America is so far down below in having the best healthcare system. However, there's one caveat. It has a great healthcare system for those at the very top. But for everything else, everybody else, we fail. And the way politicians have been promoting healthcare, they've been talking about Obamacare being a rationing of healthcare. They've spoken about all these issues, lines, waiting lines, all these things. What they assume is that Americans are dumb, and Americans don't realize that they've had waiting lines for a long time. They don't realize that they have had rationing, because if you can't afford to go see the doctor, you don't. Is that the definition of rationing?
Yeah.
It is in the context of, I guess, the guy who ran for president, Mitt Romney. It's self-rationing, I guess. Instead of self-deportation, maybe self-rationing.
I think one thing to think about with our politicians is that they do come from a particular class by and large, and they live in a particular world of information and statistics that actually has very little contact with the day-to-day reality that Americans live in. And when you talk about telling stories to the guy in Starbucks, I would like to see us all invited to the White House and to Congress to tell real stories to them about what's really going on, because I feel like they're actually extremely out of touch. And part of that is something I know you also really care about as an issue is the media. And one of the major problems you must run up against a lot is the lack of factual information going out into the public discourse.
That is so true. There's an article that I wrote for Daily Kos a few months ago, and it was about Chuck Todd. Chuck Todd interviewed David Onstein about a book he wrote that said, Republicans are the ones that have really been causing most of the demise of the public discourse and all these issues. And when one of the things that Chuck was talking to Onstein about, he said, those bloggers are trying to really stick it to the mainstream media. They want to make us irrelevant and make it that when the first place people go for their news are blogs. To which I said, amen. Yes.
Yeah.
Why do we want that? Because let's look at this week's story. This week's story is about Dick Cheney. One of the major stories, Dick Cheney coming out and saying that the one person that has damaged most people or caused the damage to most people and the ineffectiveness of American foreign policy is Obama. That's coming from Dick Cheney. You know you have a problem in the media when the person that refuted that at the highest level was Megyn Kelly from Fox News.
Yes.
Okay? When that is the case, when MSNBC wasn't the first one to really excoriate that statement, it tells you something about the type of media that we're in. It tells you that, yes, this is a corporatocracy. When you see stories, you know, the reason we're so ready to condemn the rest of the world for anything that happens outside of America is that we know so very little about the rest of the world. I remember when President Bush invaded Panama, there were two stories. There was a story that my father was telling me while the bombs were falling and he was running under his bed, fearing that the bombs that were blowing up Colon, the eastern city, you know, he was, I mean, petrified and saw all the things that happening compared to the stories that we were getting here in the United States. If you look at what you know in reading foreign journals from around the world, I mean, if you go ahead and read something even in Great Britain, you see that it's a completely different context that we have here. Americans are lied to all the times, and they're not lied to directly. They're lied to implicitly. In other words, the way they're lied to is that corporations get distills to come on air and say certain things, and they go unchecked, or they just allow it to slide by within the mainstream media. And then they worry about, or they are concerned about, why are the Americans polling the way they're polling? Well, Americans are lost. Mm-hmm.
We'll be back with Egberto in just a little bit. In the meantime, Rivera and I are going to discuss an unexpected source for some hard-hitting political commentary and a sign that political consciousness is spreading beyond our cloistered activist circles. You're listening to Occupy Radio from KWVA Eugene and the Pacifica Radio Network, streaming at kwvaradio.org and podcasting at occupythemedia.podomatic.com. I'm your host, David Geitgey Sierralupe. Hey, I was listening to some sports radio the other day, Rivera, and was thinking of you, as a matter of fact.
Oh, because I'm such a sports fan?
Oh, yes. You are my number one person to talk to whenever the sports scores are really in my head. But no, actually, I suspect that sports is one of the last things you want to talk to me about. But,
well, what were you listening to on the sports channel?
I was listening to sports radio, as I was driving around town, and, major sports station. And the anchor for the show at that point in time, there's baseball games going on. We're trying to figure out if LeBron is going to leave Miami or, all this stuff going on. And this guy, I'm driving along through the streets of Eugene. He's talking about the militarization of America's police forces.
Is that a sport now?
I'm betting if you go behind the scenes, I'm betting they do keep score. I'm pretty sure.
That's awful. That's really awful in light of Albuquerque PD and the fact that that might actually be going on.
Well, I do recall a video where I think it was in Oakland, California, where a woman stood up to a line of cops and they shot her with a beanbag or a rubber bullet, I don't recall, as she was walking away. She was no longer a threat to them, and they shot her as she was walking away. And they have a recording afterwards of the sergeant debriefing everybody, and he's like, I don't know who shot that lady, but that was great. So, yeah.
Oh, my gosh. Wow. Well, when the cops get this out of hand, I'm actually very glad that our sports announcers are taking a little break from commenting on what are games and sports to talking about these issues that actually are very impactful on people's actual, living, breathing, walking around lives. So what did he say? I mean, was he talking about any ways that we could maybe reverse this trend or what the effects this trend has?
I think he was mostly using his podium to get the word out. He mentioned former guest of ours, Radley Balco, and his book. And, he talked about how it's not that unreasonable for cops to feel a little uneasy about their reception because they're so violent these days. That was one of the things he said is, you look back in the old days and what was the police department recruitment reel? They'd be talking about how you're going to be working with public services and you're going to do this and that to make society better. And now the recruitment reel is, look at these great weapons you're going to get to play with. And those two different recruitment techniques are going to bring a different kind of person.
There also was a report that recently came out about how the Pentagon is bracing for civil unrest and civil society breakdowns, which I have not had a chance to read, but I think between this show and the next show, we should all take a peek at that and learn what the Pentagon is expecting. And because, when our society is headed the direction it is, there's a certain amount of breakthrough that definitely needs to happen. And to break through requires a little bit of breakdown. And that's what we see as social change movements. The authorities often see as societal breakdowns, protests, strikes, demonstrations, sit-ins, occupations. That's the other side of the coin to them is civil unrest, But when we have our cops armed to the teeth, walking around like soldiers and thinking of we the people as the enemy, as we know they are being trained to think that way, it creates a very volatile and tense situation on every street corner. And that would be a major concern for me if I was the chief of police. How to keep my officers safe would be how to change public perception of our police. But, I'm a radio show host, not a police officer.
And
they can
one
ask
of
me,
those
though.
liberal radio show hosts.
Oh, God forbid.
Yeah.
We should get some police chiefs on the show and ask them some of these questions sometime.
I think that's a good idea. I definitely think so. But we did just manage to talk quite a bit about the cops, and we haven't yet talked about the media stuff, which we're going to have to put on hold for another week or so, because time to get back with Egberto. We're back with Egberto Willies, talking about occupying the media, paying activists, and then finally, class warfare. How do you feel about Al-jazeera? You're talking about a perspective outside of America giving us an honest take on things. How about Al-jazeera? Or what do you feel like is a trustworthy media source, if not something like that?
I find it interesting that Al-jazeera is one of the most trusted. I don't read Arabic, but I read Al-jazeera English. And when you find that Al-jazeera English and even some of the CNN correspondents went over to Al-jazeera, it tells you something. Okay? I am not here to defend countries or defend anything of that sort. I'm just here to see who can give me reliable information that I can quote, that I can validate. And I'm going to be honest with you, Al-jazeera, as far as I am concerned, present pretty darn good news. I would love to hear what both of you think about that.
I follow Al-jazeera when it pops up. I haven't lately made it a point to really search out what they have to say, but I agree that if I want something that I feel like doesn't have the corporate spin, Al-jazeera is a good place to go. I'm a little concerned, though, because it is such a high-profile media organization that it's just like becoming president of the United States. If you become a global media corporation, how much of your soul have you had to sell out to get to that point?
Right. I tell you what, in the long run, Al-Jazeera may just become what CNN has become. In other words, there was a time when CNN was fairly reliable. Then they started doing the book or the ship in the middle of the Gulf and, all these crazy stories. And then they started to lose their credibility by allowing more people to misinform and not correct them. So, I agree with you that in the long run, whenever a news media adopts a corporate structure, its reliability probably wanes. And I think that is one of the good reasons why I think bloggers, and, I get some pushback on some of my shows when I really push bloggers as sources of information. Good bloggers do several things. They fact check best they can. And not only that, but if I hear a story about Dick Cheney, I'm not going to only pick it up from Fox News. I may look to see Fox News, MSNBC, and all these other different networks and try to do some other validation. And within that one story, put it. You don't find that much anymore, especially online, because of the way these guys want to keep most of your links internally. So one of the reasons I am for this new media style, blogging and more information, it has some risks in that the same good information that bloggers give, you could get the corporations paying false bloggers to do the same, right? Uh-huh. So it becomes a chicken and an egg situation. It becomes always chasing what is valid information. And, it's a struggle, but I think good bloggers get good followers make good rebloggers, and truth ultimately gets out there.
Yeah, we're just launching OccupyRadio.org, and one of the things we're doing is we're reposting articles from other sources, a lot of bloggers. And that's been my focus lately, is that I don't really want to repost the story that everybody has read, and I want to find the people who might have the really good content, but they don't necessarily have the big audience. And exactly like you're saying, find the good bloggers, especially the ones who aren't known, and start to get those voices out there, because you're right. That's how we really, I'm all focused on occupy the media. That's how we occupy the media, is by advancing the unheard voices and bringing them up onto that same level playing field with the big boys.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we need to do in our sphere, if you will, is a lot more cooperation with media. There is enough space in this entire media for us to do our job, well, and still be able to some extent use the corporatocracy that we're fighting against to make some income at the same time that we're moving a cause forward, because we have to be realistic. If you are going to be out there all day doing something, you have to find some way to also support your family as you're doing good.
I agree with you there.
We're kind of falling into one of the hot button topics of activism and socially aware people.
Let's dive into that. Yeah, Rivera, let's dive into that.
Yeah, just the idea of we are against money in politics. We're against massive amounts of wealth concentrated in the hands of the few. We're against the destructive applications of wealth. But are we truly against incomes for people, particularly when they're making and earning those incomes through what the Buddhists call right livelihood? What are your thoughts on that, Egberto?
Could you explain what right livelihood means?
Yeah, right livelihood is a Buddhist term that has to do with looking at the whole chain and cycle of how one's basic needs are met. And in the work that one does, is every aspect of that work, to the best of one's ability, creating justice in the world, creating equality, creating an end to suffering. And if you can say yes, or if you can say I'm working towards all of those things, then you're in a path of right livelihood.
I agree 100%. I think that a lot of us are out there that are activists, but we still have to go into the grocery store and buy bread. If we don't eat the bread, we die. If we die, we're no longer activists. If we're no longer activists, we can no longer do good. What fills in that chain? The ability to sustain yourself. If I'm listening to you correctly, within that chain, whatever you're doing for making income is not overtly, and the reason I'm using overtly is that none of us know exactly what. If I buy bread from a company who ultimately buys wheat from a slave-driven country, I am partially keeping that chain alive. But if it's the only chain alive, I may have to use that avenue until I am able to effect the difference that I need to effect. And sometimes I have to do that to be able to effect, at least that's my opinion, to be able to effect that change. So I think sometimes on our side of the equation, in our idealism, and I can tell you, I'm a very idealistic person. I consider myself a warrior against the system for all that it has done to folks and continue to do to folks. But in the same light, I honestly do not have an issue in using that same system for an ulterior motive to get us where we need to get. Because whether it's me, whether it's you, it's going to happen. And in a lot of our circles, there's a problem. Some people view that as a problem. I view it as something we should always talk about as long as we're ensuring that what we are doing is moving us forward. As an example, my book, your book, Rivera, we're enlightening folks, but we also know that Amazon is one of the biggest parts of the corporatocracy, and we also know that Amazon has some employee-related problems. That doesn't stop me from working for a living wage for all those that are working for Amazon, as Amazon makes a profit selling my book.
And we could put our podcasts out on iTunes, and Apple is certainly not above reproach. We had this debate about whether activists should be paid for their work earlier this year, and I was struck by the opposing viewpoint was one of we need to separate ourselves from the need for cash in the standard point of view, and instead we need to build up a community of people who will inter-support each other. Don't ask to be paid for what you're doing. If you need food, then mutual assistance, from other people supply your food and whatnot. But it occurs to me that while that approach will separate you from the sin of money, eventually somebody in that whole network that is supplying your needs altruistically has to be getting income to help you supply your needs. So it seems to me that whole concept just doesn't work after a while, that eventually you're right. We do have to turn ourselves over to make a living through the corporate structure. And I don't have anything against the corporate structure. What I have against is the way it's being used now. It's an effective tool, and we can use that as a tool, but we have to take control over it, which goes back to the whole idea of class warfare, because class warfare is largely a tool of the corporatocracy, I think. How do you see that?
I agree with you 100%. And that's why I said earlier on that we are all idealistic. However, some of us allow our ideology to prevent us from making progress. And whenever that occurs, that is just as bad as no progress at all, or having you not even attempt to make progress. So on my website, I have a whole bunch of ads. There are a whole lot of ads there that I don't necessarily support. But you know what? I made that concerted effort that I was going to put stories out there. I put stories out every day. I go out and I do my videos of activist events to try to get the things out. I'm going to be doing some TPP stuff and all of that. But I also have a daughter who's going to med school that I have to support, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the reality is, idealism is fine. However, it can actually reach to the point where it ensures that you stay just on the sidelines, where you can always be marginalized unless you find a structure. And I think that's what you were talking about. That was enlightening, actually, when you talk about for all those people that are giving you within this social network. Ultimately, the high man and the totem pole is still working within the corporatocracy, and it all evens out. The only difference about it is I would say that it's a lot more efficient is if you have the wherewithal. I'm not saying there are some who may not at any given time, but if you have the wherewithal to use a system to do your activism at the same time that you can make an honest living, that should never, ever be criticized. How many people criticize Soros giving money to the Sierra Foundation? I work in several different organizations, activist organizations, and we all are writing grants or writing application for grants.
That's right.
Where do you think these grants are coming from? So we have to be honest with that we live in a corporatocracy. We live in an oligarchy. We're trying to change that. And the only way that we're going to ever really be able to change that is to have some people with their toe tipping in there, but their body and their minds elsewhere. And that is how I think, that's how I function. I know that I want to do good. I will continue to attempt to do good. I also know I have a responsibility to a family. I also know that I have responsibility to others that follow a lot of what I'm doing. And it would be irresponsible of me to attempt to ask many that are following, that are really wanting to do well, but has to do within certain parameters, that somehow they don't meet this ideological test of whatever it is that we are talking about. I wouldn't do that, because I think to move our message forward, I think to move ourselves forward, we have to have the means of exchange that the people we are trying to not demolish, but the people that we're trying to bring into compliance are using.
Yeah, I think, when we look at the scope of the problem, it's kind of all hands on deck. And when you start kicking people off the ship for not meeting your own ideals, you're really kicking yourself in the butt. But I really want to get a little bit more into class warfare again and just look at the ways that you observe. Well, first of all, I just want to say that whenever people bring up the phrase class warfare, my response is always, yes, there is a war going on and it takes two sides. And you know what? We're going to win ultimately. So, rather than flinching at the accusation that we, the underprivileged, are launching warfare against the rich, we might reconstruct our minds to think perhaps there is a war that needs to go on to actually make more equality and justice in this world. And of course, I always like to remind people we're talking nonviolent war, nonviolent struggle, because it's more effective for us. But Egberto, where do you see the struggle taking place? Where do you see the most interesting forms of struggle emerging?
Well, a lot of people think it is electoral. I don't think it starts electorally. We here all know this material. Most Americans don't. Once I wrote a piece that I said, this election where everybody was talking about we should run on the income inequality phrase, I said, no, we should not run on the income inequality phrase. We need to run on a phrase that means income inequality that everybody understands. Then somebody wrote me and asked me, so what is that phrase going to be? I said, I don't know, but I just know that if I sit down in Starbucks, and you'll notice I always say Starbucks, because I always sit down in there reading, typing, and doing all that kind of stuff when I'm blogging. And I talk to a lot of people, and I bring up a phrase, income inequality, and a lot of times people kind of have a feeling what it is, but they either think it doesn't have anything to do with them, or they think it's one of those lefty terms. So, but then again, I'm in Texas. But that's it. So I think one of the major things that we're going to have to do is educate. And I know it's a slow process, and it sounds tedious, and it sounds unsexy. But I think from what I'm doing, from what you're doing with this show, from what others are doing with many shows, we start the education process, and we have selective actions. I mean, there's a coffee party group in New York doing something called Don't Do Koch, in which they stand up at a place and they show people all the things that they are doing that really are affecting themselves. So, I mean, I think we're going to have little actions that get attention into people's psyche to first delineate what income inequality is. Then the next thing that we're going to have to talk about, and something that everybody hates to talk about, is redistribution. People think about redistribution as those lower class people or those middle class people taking something that was earned from a rich person. We're going to have to redefine what redistribution means. I think we have to redefine what redistribution means by saying the truth. And what is that truth? A lot of the wealthy, in fact, if not most of the wealthy, have gotten their wealth from ill-gotten gains. Ill-gotten gains mean that why should a teacher who, I think teachers are some of the most important people in our society. They provide the most because they're the one that moves our knowledge forward. They're the ones who ensure that the next generation has the institutional knowledge of everything past. So therefore, they're the most important, yet they're struggling. A stockbroker who simply moves a piece of paper and make millions and billions, he takes all that money out of the economy. He's doing it legally. However, it's still ill-gotten gains, because the gains that he's made are gains that should have been distributed throughout the economy for what everybody had provided. When that person trades a corporation. That corporation is dependent on all the knowledge, the some knowledge that was given by all those teachers to all those children that went to college, that went to med school, and all these things that created that environment for this supposedly free enterprise system to have given the ability for capital to grow in that manner. And the only way that ill-gotten gain is recovered is that we have some sensible form of redistribution, but we have to get people to believe that that is their money that was stolen. And unless we can frame it in a way that they really, really realize that is stolen dollars, that CEO that is getting $100 million, that's stolen money from the workers, unless we get people to start thinking in that frame, the corporatocracy frame of thinking that prevails on TV is what we get.
And basically what we're talking about is redistributing funds that were already redistributed upward. So,
exactly.
Yeah. But I like the idea of framing it as a theft, because that hits people on a more visceral angle. And you keep talking about hanging out in Starbucks, and you keep talking about coffee. And I notice that on your website, you're listed as a vice president of Coffee Party USA, which we haven't heard much of in the recent years. I think Occupy took the thunder out of that. Is there still a Coffee Party USA?
We are sort of restructuring right now. I'm no longer the vice president. I'm on the board of directors, however, and we're doing some restructuring right now. And we hope in the next few weeks to have a new board seated and have things running, and actually going in alliance with not only groups like different sects of the Occupy movement, but Move to Amend. Remember what I said earlier on in the discussion, that I think all of us that are moving towards what I like to call rebuilding the middle class, or trying to support each other who has middle class centric policies on the tip of our tongues, we are going to try, assuming the board works out the way we're attempting to get things done ethically and democratically, we really want to start working with other groups to share our spectrum so that we can have that bigger reach, because we're not going to be getting it from the traditional mainstream media. So we want to kind of tie all these guys together. Every group has its high points, and then it drops out of contention for a while, then it goes back up, that sort of thing. So we should be back.
Well, that'll be an exciting unfolding. As a Green Party member, I have also watched those ups and downs. And, I think one of the major things that we all struggle with in this country is not just money in politics, but actually the very regressive laws that keep our third parties out of politics. And I'm going to ask you something that I ask the Green Party a lot, which is, you are very clear that change doesn't necessarily happen through electoral process, but one thing I propose to the Greens all the time is there's a whole toolbox of social political tools that people can pick up, which fall under the category of nonviolent action. And is this something that the Coffee Party is also looking at activating and empowering people with in their work?
I can speak for one person, and that's myself right now. And the reason why is, there's a board, but we have been a place where we do a whole lot of talking. And, a safe place where people can talk. I think we've been safe enough for 4 years. I think it's time. I love what you said. Okay. In other words, I think more organizations need to be doing exactly what I think you are not exactly proposed, but I think implied. I wholeheartedly believe in the type of actions that your statement implies.
Great.
We're talking with Egberto Willies, who is the host of Politics Done Right on 90.1 KPFT in Houston, I believe you said, right, Egberto?
Yes, it's in Houston. It covers Houston, Galveston, Livingston, and all major areas.
All right. And, of course, the author of the book, As I See It, Class Warfare, The Only Resort to Right-Wing Doom, which is something that we're all kind of focused on these days. And this has been a very fun, very lively conversation, Egberto, and I really appreciate you coming on Occupy Radio and joining Rivera and me. And we do have a couple minutes left, and if you have any other points you want to hit before we wrap up this interview, I encourage you right now to share them with us.
Well, first of all, let me tell you, I am honored to be on your show. I love the work that you all do. I think it is important, and I think it is something that we have to do. I'd like to tell you that I hope that we will collaborate both with Move to Amend and Coffee Party when we get all of those little wrinkles straightened out. And I'd like to ask your audience to, give my blog site a little visit, egbertowillies.com, and take a look at it and, give us some feedback. And I thank you very much for having me on your show.
And you can find out more about Egberto Willies on egbertowillies.com. That is EGBERTOWILLIES.com, where you can find his radio shows, his blog posts, and recent news and events.
Feel about media that's brought to you by international corporations and advertisers just wanting to sell you more garbage to fill up our landfills and destroy the earth?
Ew, no way!
Okay. Well, how about if there was an alternative to that? What if there was an alternative of, say, 6 different shows every week brought to you by loving, caring individuals who just want to bring you news and information in an unfiltered and unbiased way?
Ooh, that's good.
Oh, Jules, that's good to hear. You can find all of those shows at occupythemedia.podomatic.com or just search out Occupy the Media in iTunes.
Occupy the Media!
Occupy Radio is produced through KWVA 88.1 FM on the campus of the University of Oregon. Nathan Stevens is our producer, and we have support from OEMG, the Occupy Eugene Media Group.
Thanks this week to Egberto Willies, and thanks to my co-host, Rivera Sun.
We're always looking forward to hearing from you. You can reach us at Occupy Radio 23 on Twitter and Gmail. We are Occupy Radio on Stitcher and iTunes, where you can give us those lovely 5-star reviews. You can find us on Facebook on the Occupy Radio group page, and we are occupyradio.org.
For Occupy Radio, I'm David Geitgey Sierralupe. When you think about it, occupiers, class warfare is nothing new. If agriculture is 12,000 years old, then I think class warfare has got to be at least 11,000 years old. But then again, the internet and all of its promise is just over 40 years old, so maybe some class warfare internet magic will happen by the time we talk to you next week.